whatever the date is.
Do you have everybody that you need?
Yes.
5 to 6.
No, August. Oh, date is?
It's 5 to 6.
What did I say?
5 to 7. It's okay.
5:57.
Oh, 57, sorry.
On August 7th, this session called to order. And our first topic is building lot data. And I think, Steve, you're going to walk us through
I
this.
am. So Adam has given us several data sets. I'm going to pull up the chart that he sent, just to give you aggregated data. And there are 5 blocks that were asked for. Boston Way, Breckenridge, Forest View, Lake Ridge, and I'm calling it Lemmy East. If you remember, that was the, I think Paul described it as a sliver at our last meeting, and so I was able to with him, and he's able to share location. So, this is the Boston Way piece that we looked at. Let me just shrink that a little bit. There we go. So you can see one of the things that we like to use are those natural demarcation lines. So here we clearly have the edges of the Kirkwood tenants area, and then we look right up the road here. And then for each of these, so I'll go through it right now in more detail, and then you'll just see when we get to the next ones. For each of these are the numbers as of August 7th, and they're K-6 kids that are live-in, and there are 102 of them. You can see the ethnic demographics, the socioeconomic demographics, ELL, special ed, and then this is where they live. So each of those dots represents a family unit. There could be 1, 2, 3, 4 kids there, but that is an address that is connected to it. So then we also pulled Breckenridge. Oh wait, I apologize, I'm doing I might pop over to the big map if you have questions, because I know a couple of you have said, geographically, I need a little bit more context for where this is. So just to make sure that everybody has a high comfort level with where each of these areas are at. So this is our 1920 map. And I know, unfortunately, by the way, we don't get to pick these colors, so the fact that they made Coralville Central and Kirkwood 2 different shades of purple, which for me makes it very hard to see the difference. This is Kirkwood right here. Boston Way is right over here. So think Coral Ridge Mall right next door. Okay, so that's our Boston Way neighborhood. The next neighborhood that was asked for, and these just go in alphabetical order.
Wait, and so but this group currently goes to?
This group currently goes to Kirkwood, right? The next group that was asked for is Breckenridge. You can see the data up there. This one, if you don't know where it is harder to identify. It's right down here off of 6. So it is a mobile home community that you literally kind of feel like you're driving out in the country before you get there. So it's fairly isolated. Right now those students go to Lemmy. So if you look over here at the 1819 elementary maps, you can see them there in the same green as Lemmy is over here. And then when you look at 1920, you see that they're assigned to New Hoover. And so those are the demographic statistics for that group. There's 47 here. You may ask why there aren't any dots on here. They all have one address. So they deliver mail out there, and then it gets parceled out by lot number, but it goes to one address, and so you don't see the individual dots that you'd see on the others. Forest View, let this one come up, as you take a look at that. Forest View is this area, and you can see on here, we grabbed the area surrounded by the river and then out to the road and the roadway, and so that is this piece right here. If you look over here at 1819, you see that part of that, not all of it because the road separates it, but most of that, and actually the area that has all the students, is assigned to man. And then you can see over here where we follow the roadway. That one doesn't exactly follow the roadway, but the parcels on the other side are non-residential. And that now is assigned to Lincoln. And so you can see that group again, 105 kids, and the demographics connected to that. And then our next group is Lake Ridge. I know we've got lots of ridges here. This one is also a mobile home community. I'll go to the 1819 map. That's right here. So it's an island that right now currently assigned to Twain. And then you can see over here, connected and assigned to Alexander. And that community has 105 students, K-6. And then the last one that we looked at was for, we're calling it Lemmy East. I'm just going to shrink this a little bit so you can see it a little bit better. Okay. And that might be a little bit harder for you to see, but I'll go over here to the 1819 map. And that is, my berries here. So actually it might be easier to see on the 1920 map, just because of the way New Hoover is laid out. So it's this piece of land right here. And again, demarcated by major roadways. So we've got Rochester up here, and it follows right along here. There are some non-residential areas in there. There's a senior living facility that's in there, and then there are some homes down here. So again, if you look at the bigger map here, you can see it following the roadway down here, and then up along the east side of what's designated as the levy attendance
The
area.
left side is Scott Boulevard.
I'm sorry, yeah, left side is Scott Boulevard, Rochester up here, and then the east side of the levy attendance
This
area.
is where Blackstone is, that little area.
Yes, yeah, and that is 41 students.
Top restaurants.
And they currently go to Levy and they're potentially, where are they, are they staying in Levy for?
Yes, they're assigned to levy for the next one. And so just maybe as you go back and look at the overall numbers, we didn't connect these to individual schools in this go-around. What we were hoping to do was get some feedback from you. We know that some of the conversation anecdotally, both while we were in session and out of session, was can we figure out how many kids are here? Because what if we move these students in and these students out? Although there hadn't been a lot of discussion about where these students would go, but there was a question about what does the swap look like. You can see 47 in Breckenridge, 41 in that east section of Lemmy there. So if the Breckenridge kids stayed at Lemmy and the kids in that eastern sliver over there were moved out, that'd be about an even swap there. There were conversations about with Forest View, in particular in relation to the pairing of Man and Shimmick, with the efficiencies that would be generated from that. One of the things that the board had asked at that last meeting was, would there be enough room to move the Forest View students in? So that's something that we can talk about. The Lake Ridge kids, there was a question about whether or not we could leave them at Twain. And the question was, how many students would that be? Because then the question is, who would be displaced and where would you find 105 students to move out? So that's a relatively large number. Boston Way, the question there was if you were to move the Boston Way students out, I think Lori had talked about moving them south to Borlaug, how many kids would that be? So what we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that you had an idea how many students lived in each of those blocks, because then I think the next step for us is if you have destinations for those kids, if you say, if we move this neighborhood into this school, what would the capacity look like? How many kids might you need to move out in order to accommodate them? We can start looking at those as those dominoes fall for you. So there's your numbers, and I will tell you that I had some email dialogue with Lori, and she asked some specific questions about when we get ready to start trying to pair those up. And her questions were, could you assign the Lake Ridge students to Lincoln if the Forest View students were moved out? So for instance, in this group, our Lake Ridge kids are 105, our Forest View kids are 105. So we can do that for you. I can bring that map in for you next time. Adam's all ready to run the data on that. So that would be a removal of one attendance area from Lincoln and the addition of another one. She did not say send necessarily the Forest View kids. When she pulled them out, rather she said the Forest View kids, could they go to Man in 19 as a standalone, or could they go to a Shimmick Man if it was paired? So we can also run those numbers for you too. So those are two that we'll run for you for sure. And if there are others that you want us to run for next Tuesday, especially in particular with these parcels, if you let us know, we can definitely have those ready.
One of the ones that I've asked for, I think, I've talked to you about a little bit, was Lake Ridge, and actually tweaking it just a little bit to go up farther north a little bit. So Lake Ridge and that little part that I've talked to you about.
Yep.
And sending them to actually see what it would look like at Longfellow instead of Lincoln necessarily. And then the Breckenridge, like I've said, was be Lemmy, And Lemmy East would be Hoover.
Yep.
And I think, looking at sending, I'd like to see what, to send Boston Way to Borlaug, especially if we're gonna be talking about pairing those schools, then that would be less of a transition for those kids to be going to Borlaug for a year, and the next year they'd be paired, and so that
Yep.
would minimize that. And I like that idea of not, because those Forest View kids, right now, if they end up going to Lincoln, that whole neighborhood is gonna move, and then those kids are gonna have another transition pile on them. So I'd like to see them stay at Man another year to minimize that transition on them. And then, if Lake Ridge ends up going to Lincoln or somewhere else, but since Forest View is not really gonna be, the demographics are gonna change pretty significantly, I think, in the next few years. I just like the less, not have as many, they switch to Lincoln and then they move across town and then they gotta go some other schools.
Yeah, we kind of talked about that last meeting, like, when you had talked to the city a little bit. Was there a sense of like how fast that was gonna move?
They didn't want to make any commitments to that about either the size or the timing. So there's been, as they look to rezone that area that currently hosts one of the mobile home communities, they're anticipating a fairly significant drop in population before the rezoning, but they weren't real specific about that. Just that it's in the works as they look at that redevelopment. And the initial input was the numbers in the future will look very different than the numbers from last year, which is what we were talking about at the time.
I guess one concern I would have with Lake Ridge to Lincoln is the distance.
We can get that distance for you too.
And just roughing it off of Google Maps, 4 to 5 miles.
We can go to Verse Trans and do a dot to dot for you.
You were talking about the long stuff.
So in the one pairing, we'll move Forest View to Man, or keep it at Man, and move Lake Ridge into Lincoln, run those numbers, we'll get a distance for you on the drive from entrance of Lake Ridge to the front door at Lincoln. Then we'll do Lake Ridge plus that north section of Longfellow. And we'll do Breckenridge to Lemmy, and that Lemmy East section out by Scott Boulevard to New Hoover. And then we'll also do Boston Way to Borlaug. Is there anything else you'd like to see on data set as we come in?
And so right now, Lake Ridge is going to 20.
Yeah, so if you look at the FAR map over there, you can see it in brown. It's relatively easy to see the
That
island.
makes sense. If they went to Longfellow, it'd be kind of the same, the transition would be less for that.
Right. I think that's what Paul discussed last time. I know he and I talked about that offline too. All right, are there any other of those building blocks that you'd like to see data sets on?
I wish I knew them better,
Yeah.
As I talk to people in the community, I'm like, I don't know what that
You're-
neighborhood is or who lives over here.
I've had that conversation with multiple board members, which is why I now go to the maps and point them out, because there's been a question about which ridge one is that one and where does that fit. So if you get input between now and the next board meeting from any community members about any particular subsets out there, if you let us know, Adam's back and ready to go, and we can pull some of that stuff pretty quickly now. What we'll do is we'll attach them to a map, so you'll actually see that as an attendance area, so you can see what that looks like. We'll pull the demographics on it, just like the big chart, so you get to see it going across and see how they compare with each other. All right.
Very good.
I think, well, at least the three, the Breckenridge, the Lake Ridge, the Lemmy, those change for 19, so
Right.
at least we want to kind of put some emphasis on that so that they know ahead of time if they're going to the new school or staying in an old school.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, we will have that for you next Tuesday.
All right, Christine. Up next, school pairings week, which is the front reports.
Okay, I think last last time we shared with you, we had a ton of topics generated, and I promised we'd stick to like 2 or 3 minutes per slide. We're gonna do our best, so I'm looking over at people in the 2 minutes.
I thought that was gonna be 8 slides.
Well, okay, we're gonna go really fast. Some of these
1
you've
minute a
seen
slide, try.
previously. Just a reminder what the student group demographics would look like. Steve had shared this a couple of board meetings ago, I believe, in board docs. You could follow across to see what the changes would be for FRL status, ELL, special ed, what that total number would look like, and then how it differentiates. You might be asking, well, why does ELL look like it does in these particular pairings? Both Longfellow and Shimmick have not had ELL programming in the past, but again, this is the first year where all of our buildings will have ELL programming. So some of those kiddos were sitting in other buildings. So I won't spend any time on those 2 slides. As we continue to look at this, we parsed it out into 2 major areas: management and planning considerations, and then programming considerations. So under management and planning then, we're going to talk about start and end times, materials, PD, and then secondary feeder patterns. As I thought about this, I started with what our current reality is. Start and end times for elementary and secondary, 7:55 to 2:55 is our elementary schedule, and secondary 8:50 to 4 o'clock. And then factors that I thought about that would support using those current times was the recent board task force work to put these times in place. And then busing. Right now at Durham, we have tiered routes for busing. And so as soon as we get our elementary kiddos dropped off, those same buses are going out for secondary routes. Something we'll need to consider is Durham's fleet. So in anticipation that these pairings would increase our need for busing, is Durham's fleet capable of doing that? Do we incur extra cost if the fleet isn't ready and available to be able to support using the current times? Those are considerations. Elementary teacher contract start and end times. Currently our elementary teachers work from 7:40 to 3:40. Our secondary teachers work from 8:15 to 4:15. And so already we are struggling with any sort of common K-12 PD opportunity. I think there's roughly about a 20 or 25 minute period in between there when we do early release that they could actually be together at any one point. So we're already struggling as we move to these start and end times with that. So if we were to consider yet a different time for one of those 2 buildings in this pairing, that would really hurt our professional development opportunities when we would want elementary staff together district-wide.
So Amy, it never dawned on me that we would consider different start times for different paired schools. I just assumed that elementary did all have the same start time, but it sounds like that's an option.
That came up at the last conversation when we were here together at the table, so we put that down, we went back and looked at it, and we really only have the option to use the 2 times, because what we'd have to do is if we had elementaries that were at a different time, that different time would have to align with the secondary time so that we could essentially tier that other elementary school just like the secondaries, so that we don't incur the cost of additional buses in the fleet. So you'd really wind up looking at having to move an elementary to an 8:50 to 4 schedule in order to make that work. So we wanted to look at that because that came up as a consideration of could we stagger the start times of the elementary schools, and logistically there aren't enough buses in the fleet to run a 3rd tier, and so we'd have to run a 2nd tier, and that would have to align with the secondary start time.
I thought though that we might get that request from parents in addition to having someone bring that up at the board table a couple weeks ago.
So just, sorry if I can jump in, so if you're looking at like the Twain Longfellow situation, since the schools are so close, and I would assume, I don't know, are there any buses that go to Longfellow? Will there be?
There are now.
Well, take away the.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay, so you would still just have the kids that are bused to Twain,
Right.
right? So, I mean, would you have to tier that then, or could they just be?
Or we even talked a little bit this morning, I mean, could you do a drop-off at 7:55, have those same kids even on the bus and go over to Longfellow and do an 8:05 drop-off? Again, we don't know, that's something we'll have to explore more during the transportation.
And by the way, there's as we went through and Not all of these are clean, so you'll hear a little bit about, from an operational standpoint, about transportation when Craig's in here next week, because transportation was an issue, but it winds up living in both worlds because it has a significant impact on our educational schedule. And so he'll talk about it more from a logistics and cost standpoint. Amy was looking at it more from a, can we make this work with a bell schedule format? So you're going to hear a little bleed in both of them.
Okay, next I'll introduce Diane, who I think you all know. She put together the slide for curriculum and library materials.
Sure, and most of the curriculum materials are housed within a classroom. So where that classroom goes, those materials will go. So there really would be no impact with those. There's just some, when you think about library materials that serve an entire building, and you would think that instead of having 2 libraries that are K-6, and when you do a library in elementary, it probably serves books preschool probably up through 9th grade. Instead of having 2 of those, you would kind of focus this library on upper grade kids, this library on lower grade kids. As you bring those libraries together, you could have some duplication of materials, which would provide maybe some more access, more Harry Potter books for kids. You also, though, may have some issues of, you know, some 2nd grade kids who are higher readers. Maybe their library doesn't extend, you know, as far as what their reading ability might be. So there could be some situation where you might limit some access. We have some other materials that we would say intervention materials maybe that we might buy a kit for 2nd grade. So the 2nd grade teachers use it. Well, if a 3rd grade kid maybe needs a 2nd grade intervention materials, they'll go down to their 2nd grade neighbors and borrow that. Now they might not have those 2nd grade neighbors, so you might have a little bit of limitation of access, but I think in general that it would be pretty much a non-issue as far as curricular library materials go. Questions on that? I kept it to a minute.
You talked about the library, I'm curious about music and art and PE. Do they have kind of more age segregation in their curriculums that they could target, or is it thinking art supplies or art supplies, but I'm not an artist, so.
Right. You know, that may impact. I think when I think of those curricular areas, they pretty much use the same materials, K-6, I would say. But there might be, such as instruments. You know, we would only then have band at one school instead of having to have band at 2 schools. So that could help. Orchestra, kind of the same way. Professional development, there I see really all positives, I guess, for doing something like this. What you will end up having are the possibility, we have teachers who work in grade level teams. So some schools might have 2 3rd grade teachers, some schools might have 1 3rd grade teacher, some might have 4. You know, the more you can get those 3rd grade teachers together, now all of a sudden you have a team of 5 or 6. And that's going to make a much better collaborative team than a team of 1 or 2. So I think that could be a positive. I think we are really looking more at building-based professional development. So when, for instance, our MARS people, our math resource teachers, offer PD in the summer, they offer it. Here's a K2, couple days of PD. Here's a 3-6, couple days of PD. When they go out then on Thursdays and offer PD, now you have a K12 or a K6 that we're trying to offer. Where now they could actually target that a little bit and say, these teachers need more of a lower grade professional development. These teachers need more of an upper grade. So I think targeting that could provide some nice opportunities for that. And then another area I think are, when you think about counselors and librarians that are assigned to the buildings yet serve that K-6 population, you could kind of think forward on that and say now the counselor who's assigned to this building would only have maybe 4 grades to serve. Still as many kids to serve, but that collaboration, now I only have 4 grade levels to try to match my curriculum with. So I might be able to do some more targeted collaboration, some more targeted planning. Librarians the same way. You know, they like to do and offer in the library things that support what's going on in the classroom. So instead of needing to know what's happening in 7 grades, I really only need to know what's happening in 4 grades. And it might provide me increased time to plan for those things too, because instead of planning for 7, I'm only planning for 4. So I can really spend a little bit more time on that. So I think it could be a win all around as far as professional development.
Just a couple things to note with materials in PD. Particularly our Title I buildings have access to additional funding, so they may have picked up additional intervention materials and for mathematics or reading, which means that their staff would have maybe also had the training that would have gone along with those materials. That's not a huge barrier, that's actually a win, because now if Longfellow is housing 3-6, you've got teachers in there that might have been able to run interventions in the past, and they've had the training, others that will learn along with them. So it's not necessarily a barrier, but there is some professional development materials, and potentially, depending on the pairings you're talking about, programs that have been implemented in certain buildings that haven't been in others. So for example, Avid, but we're not talking about any of our Avid buildings at this point, but something to consider. Matt, take this one.
So secondary feeder patterns would largely be unaffected with these two current pairings we're talking about here, since they're all east side feeder patterns, and they would continue to stay high, assuming those the existing 2019 boundaries. Obviously, if there's any tweaks or major shifts there, that would have to be revisited. But I got under my minute.
Good job.
You did.
Nailed it.
Wait till we get to the harder ones.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was just saying Kirkwood Borlaug right away.
Yeah.
Wrinkle there.
I might be too.
Okay, so now thinking about program considerations, you can see the 8 different programs we thought about. We're going to speak to here. Let's start out with dropout. We've got 3 directors in charge of dropout, but largely both Laura and Diane oversee dropout programs that impact the elementary level.
Mhm. So we provide, through dropout funds on the academic side at the elementary, we provide academic support teachers on a pretty, I'll say, limited basis because of funding limitations. So some of our larger schools, such as Garner, Penn, they get a 0.5 academic support teacher who's there then half a day to try to support kids who are struggling with reading. Some of our smaller schools, like a Shimmick, they get a 0.25, just a couple hours a day that someone comes there. We haven't used dropout prevention funds at our title schools, so such as Twain and Mann, because they're already being served by a higher FTE of Title I teachers. So as you're thinking about when you do the pairings, it really kind of matters if the schools stay at Title I school, or if they now drop off the Title I status, and then maybe we would think about using dropout funds. But our dropout funds are tight, and there isn't a whole lot of room in there. So the more schools that you have drop off the Title I status, the tighter that becomes, and probably the less support that those schools, the non-Title I schools, would see. They're already pretty tight. Yep, go ahead.
When Twain's Title I recertification, does that happen every year?
So every year I have to do a page on this application that is called Selection of Schools, and it's really by the FRL.
Okay.
So as long as their FRL percentage stays where it is, which they have been, then they're going to be eligible for Title I funds. And there's a Title I slide we will get to, and I'll save my minutes for that.
So I'll finish
Backing up for time.
the rest of the minute for this. So the other 3 positions at the elementary level that are partially funded through dropout prevention are student and family advocates, the SFAs. And I just listed the, so you can see it goes along with what Diane described for the academic support teachers, that we take a look at the needs of families and students in each individual school and determine an FTE that's appropriate. So right now, Twain and Mann have full-time SFAs, and then Longfellow has a half-time, and Shimmick has about a 0.3. Counselors, full-time at Twain, and then part-time at Longfellow, Mann, and Shimmick. And then behavior interventionists, we have 6 behavior interventionists working at the elementary level in just 6 of our schools, and Twain is one of those 6 schools that has that type of support. And we do have a behavior strategist at the elementary level that provides coaching and direction to those 6 behavior interventionists. So really the school that's affected the most, that receives a lot of the DOP funding is Twain, but all of them have at least partial funding through those 3 positions. The only thing it might provide an opportunity is if once we worked out a few more details, we were able to figure out, could we shave off a little FTE here or there with any of these positions because of the school pairings, but I don't think that there would be any significant adjustments to probably the support that those schools would be needed.
The assistant principal is starting at Twain for halftime, or whatever the time is this year. Was that funded through any of this, or is that just standard?
General fund.
General fund, yeah.
I'm glad the SFAs were on here, because that was something I was thinking about earlier, because they, in my experience with the SFAs, they serve families, not individual students, right? And you're talking about families are gonna be more likely to be in separate schools, so I'd be curious as to how that partnership would work if they would be doing traveling between schools more than some do now, because I think some do now, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a good point, because some student and family advocates support a family as a unit, and some, because of maybe individual students' needs, they maybe have a connection with the family, but maybe don't provide support or services to all the siblings in a family. So, yeah, that could present some of those travel needs. A lot of our student and family advocates, we have several that are full-time in buildings, but many are shared, so they're already kind of bopping around from school to school. So they're, it's normal for that to happen, but that's a good point, it would present some of those needs. Go ahead, Joan.
And I would just add that we do that already between the feeder systems. So it's very common that there's a family that has elementary, junior high, and senior high, and then there's just collaboration between the student family advocates. Who's going to take the lead on this family and coordinate with the other two?
We're potentially adding another striation there, right?
Mhm.
So
Right.
Mhm. Yep.
coordinate 4 instead of 3.
Yeah. I think our time's up at this time. I don't know.
That's not gonna put that on my
So I'll catch up some time on this one, because for our English language learning program, because we are having programs now in each of our K-12 buildings, it's kind of a non-issue. I mean, there might be an opportunity to just take a look at some of the FTE in each of the buildings, but right now Twain has approximately 100 English learners and 3 ELL teachers. Longfellow has 10 probably or less, and they're opening a program so they actually have a little more FTE than what typically is allocated from year to year, just because they need a little bit more staff training to kind of get the program off the ground. And then Shimmick and Mann, you can see the numbers there. Mann typically has about 60 English learners, about a teacher and a half equivalency, and Shimmick will probably literally have about a handful of English learners, and they'll have a little bit of FTE there too.
All right, extended learning program. That service is provided to all elementaries, and that would certainly continue. We do have a little bit of a different delivery model between K2 and 3-6, so if that were the split, that would work pretty conveniently for that. We offer this enrichment program, so we have a couple of our elementaries, about 4, and they are the high FRL schools, that we haven't identified at least 5% of the population as ELP. They just haven't met the general criteria for that. So we go into those schools and we offer enrichment courses for them. So students are identified maybe in a single subject area and will spend maybe a trimester in receiving talented and gifted services. So really this could eliminate the need for that. Depending on how we combine schools, we may end up not needing to do that enrichment piece or being able to provide that in a different manner. The one negative I do see with this kind of setup, we do have a few students throughout the district who are single subject accelerated, typically in math. So we might have a first grader who excels in math, and they just go down the hall during math class and they'll take a second grade math class, and then when they're in second grade they'll take a third grade math class. Well, that becomes problematic when the third grade math class is in another grade. We see that at the end of the elementary years when we have a 5th grader who's taking, or a 6th grader who's taking a 7th grade math class. We have a few of those instances, and we do let the parents know that if they start on that progress in the early elementaries, when they get to the end of the elementaries, they may have to do some transporting of their child to a junior high to start taking the courses. And then once they're in junior high, we start providing more accelerated math courses. We provide Algebra 2 and Geometry in junior high, so then that kind of erases that. But I could see this being a little bit of an issue for those second graders who are pretty advanced and are single subject accelerated into an upper grade. Yep.
What are the 4 elementaries that have the enrichment program?
You know what? I shouldn't probably say I don't know for sure.
Okay.
let me get that back to you. I could guess which ones they are. I know Kirkwood's one for sure. Twain, Alexander, and Wood are the ones I'm guessing, but let me double check on that.
So Diane, I guess one thing, thinking about the acceleration, like how, I don't know, it's tough to say, but do you have, like, is it a handful of kids? Is it
An idea how many? Would you
Because
know,
I guess-
Amy? I would say, I mean, some schools more than others,
Mhm.
it seems. So some schools may have a couple maybe in a grade, and some schools may not have any.
But you may
Nice.
have a situation where when you're combined, you have enough kids that you pull out where you might be able to provide an accelerated pullout if you got 10 kids
Mhm.
instead of, maybe.
Sure. It could cause us just to think differently about the way we're delivering those
Which
services.
is where I was.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
right.
Yeah,
Yep.
Well, I would say keep in mind, your combined cohort is going to be about the size of our larger elementary schools, and we usually don't hit that mark, only because we don't tend to have all those students in one particular grade or needing one particular acceleration. So I think that's been our challenge, even at our largest elementary schools like Garner. They're not in the right places that you have that mass that says separate class for those students.
All right, and then preschool, and this is making, I guess, the assumption that you would treat preschool the way you do kindergarten, so that they would also, instead of being offered at both buildings, just be offered at the one. That, again, allows for some wonderful teaming opportunities for our teachers. Instead of being the only preschool teacher at a site and having no one to collaborate with, now they might have another preschool teacher, so that could provide some really nice collaboration opportunities. Plus, I think it could also help you balance some class sizes. So you might see one school that might have, every spot full, and another school that has openings. We could do a little more balancing, if we have some more classes there. It could allow for some choice. So we have some unique opportunities right now at Twain and Mann that are offering some full-day programs where they aren't offering those at Longfellow and Shimmick at this time. So depending on how that was structured, maybe we could provide some more choices for parents in that respect as well. The negative I see is that transportation barrier. So we don't transport preschool kids, and now you are increasing that distance for half of your population. So if you decide the lower grades at Twain, then the Longfellow parents have a farther distance to transport their kids in order to access preschool. And we know transportation is already our biggest barrier for preschool. So I could see that being an issue. It does help us round out, so when you're thinking about space availability, if you add preschool as a grade, that's 4 grades, 3 through 6 is 4 grades. So you start thinking about that being kind of an even split between the two structures. Kids will spend 4 years at each building. But transportation is an issue.
Special education. This is pretty straightforward, really. The one thing to consider is that we have had a kind of a habit as a district of sending students out of their neighborhood, otherwise assigned elementary building, at times when that student has a little bit more pronounced needs and their needs can't be met at their otherwise assigned building. We're trying to get away from that. Found that that's putting a large load on only a few buildings with a lot of high need students in those buildings. Also, we're supposed to be educating students in their otherwise assigned school whenever possible. So we're trying to increase certification, the variety of certification, and have done that going into this year. So, wherever students are is where we're going to try to serve them. So that would apply in any scenario, no matter how the grade spans or, partner schools would work. The one thing I would say is that it could lead to more manageable assignments for teachers from smaller buildings. So like in our, some of our smaller buildings, we only have one special education teacher currently. And so that one teacher has to cover, the entire elementary grade span, where we had, and sometimes there's not really even enough for a full roster in those smaller buildings, but we can't take any teacher time out of that building because they're already covering such a large span. So, we shrink that down to a smaller span, and that special ed teacher would be able to spend time with the grade level teams and
possibly push into the classroom for some more inclusive services and at least meet with those PLCs to coordinate more closely with, you just can't coordinate with 7 different grade levels of PLCs. So shrinking that down at all would be, I would think most teachers would say it was an advantage. And I think it is too. Budget, again, we just have to pay whatever it costs. There really wouldn't be, I don't think, any real difference caused by this sort of a configuration. Transition, it would probably would increase the number of building transitions for students who are already vulnerable to change. So, anytime a student would move to a different building, we would have to do some prep work with them, which is not insurmountable, but it's just something to think about. It's one possible feature with negative side effects if we don't prepare for that.
Title I.
Title, there we are. So we get budget from the state, the federal government through the state, just based on our numbers of students. So that wouldn't change, doesn't matter. So that total budget would stay the same. Where we distribute that could change. So in order to be a title school, a school needs to have at least 35% free and reduced lunch at their school. So right now, Twain and Mann both meet that. In fact, if you're over 40%, you can be considered a school-wide Title I school. And school-wide means that the services can go to any child in that school, whether they're struggling or not. So you might see a Title I teacher in a classroom, and all the kids in the classroom rotate to the Title I teacher and receive some instruction. In a targeted school, so we have 2 of our schools that are targeted, that would be Weber and Horn right now. Only the kids who are below reading proficiency can receive services from a Title I teacher. So those aren't 2 of the schools that you're talking about, but at this point you've got Twain and Mann who currently meet the threshold to receive Title I services. So they get additional funding, they get additional FTE. Twain, I think, is, I want to say 2.75. Mann's a smaller school, they get 1 additional FTE, but quite a bit more than the 0.5 academic support teacher we give to non-title schools. Now with your new boundaries, I think Mann's going to fall off anyway, the Title I services, so they won't qualify either way. Mann and Shimmick together wouldn't qualify for title services, but Twain and Longfellow, then both schools could qualify for Title I services, and then both schools would receive the benefit of that. So that could be positive. We allocate the FTE pretty much based on the FRL as well and the numbers of kids at the building. So I look at the numbers of free and reduced lunch kids that buildings have, plus the numbers of kids who are currently below reading proficiency, and then we allocate FTE based on that. So Alexander, that's a little bit larger with a high FRL, they're going to get more title services than Corvallis Central, who is a little bit smaller, but certainly has a lower FRL percentage. So it's kind of based on that. We know ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the No Child Left Behind replacement. They are going to have statuses for buildings, just like No Child Left Behind did. So our schools will all have a status assigned to them this fall. I don't know that they've quite ironed out the implications of that. So if, let's say, Twain has a status, one thing, and Longfellow's is a different status when those schools combine, how does that work? So there could be some implications of that, but again, nothing that we couldn't work through.
So we just get money from the state based on our total FRL?
Yep.
As a district? And then from that point, do we make the decisions on how we disperse that out, or is that?
We pretty much make the decisions, although we couldn't disperse it to a school that's below 35% FRL.
Okay, so it has to be
Yep.
at least at that. Okay.
Yep.
And is that students in the school? See what I'm saying? So like, if you said these were the attendance zones and that population, their home school is Twain, but they're going to Longfellow,
It would be students who are served in the school.
Yeah,
Mhm.
when
That
we do
could
our
be-
official certified enrollment.
and that could be different based on the number of kids you have, right? In K2 versus 3-6. They can be. It's not going to be the same number.
It would be relatively close, you would think. probably not identical, but probably, I mean, if you're pulling from the same families,
We anticipate the numbers will be pretty close.
pretty close,
Right, I
right?
was wondering, as you have kids, you know,
Mhm.
age out, and now you've got younger kids. I'm just, I think in my own neighborhood, there's a lot of kids that will be moving out. You got a lot of young kids starting,
Mhm.
so the numbers will be,
Yeah.
if they're in two different schools, will be different.
Which would be an important issue if they're right at the threshold.
Mhm.
Before and after school program, Laura and John?
Yeah, so Joan will probably do most of the explaining. She knows the ins and outs of the 21st Century Grants, but we just received a 5-year grant for Twain, and so we would be up for that again in 2023. And that is based upon that school-wide Title I eligibility, and so some of the things that Diane just explained could impact the need for us to go back to the DE and reapply, and that's happened before, it sounds like, when Weber.
When Roosevelt
Yeah.
closed and the kids
Yeah.
at Pheasant Ridge went to Weber.
Yeah, so Joan can kind of walk us through just a couple things that we need to think about, but it's on the slide, but she's probably got some things to add to it as well.
Right, so when that happened, when Roosevelt closed, we got permission from the Department of Ed, because our grant was really written for the Pheasant Ridge kids, and they allowed the grant to follow the Pheasant Ridge kids.
Yep.
So that would be very doable. But if we're not eligible for the school-wide, for reapplication time, then that would be a ding. But I don't, I think in the interim, it would be fine. And I think then the other thing to consider is just pickup time. So we would probably share a bus, because we wouldn't have the complications of tiering with the secondary. So we would get permission to serve 3rd, 4th at Longfellow, and then just stagger the end times, because we provide transportation home from our 21st Century Schools programs.
So one of the things that I think Lori talked about last time in regards to that, a couple times ago, was having before and after school at their, whatever their true home school would be. So like if they were done with school at Longfellow, but their home school was really Twain, they'd all kind of go back to Twain and be.
We just have to get them to the other school, so that would be interesting, tricky.
I mean, I think the idea was to have, if there's students, multiple schools in one family, that at the end of the day, those kids are the same place.
Right. And if we have a bus picking up Longfellow kids, it's possible that you could pick up other kids as well, But that would be at the end of the day, it wouldn't be at,
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
we were thinking the same type of thing, though,
Mhm.
was the drop-off would be the same, right?
Right.
Like you took your kid one place for drop-off, and then when school started, if needed, there would be transportation, so they could eat breakfast or whatever at their
Right.
school, and then be transported to the other school for the start.
and for us, we provide transportation home if they're not walkers, so.
Under just the 21st century? Or
Right, right.
Not all before and after school. I think we were talking all before and after school.
Yeah, at Twain, we provide transportation for all before and after school, but we don't at Longfellow, we don't have that there, so.
Yeah. We'll keep thinking about it.
Yeah. And the next one with the summer programs is, it just doesn't really affect the summer programming much.
My question, I'm sorry, on a before and after school program, isn't there a limit to the number of kiddos that can be in?
Yes.
So potentially, because I'm assuming Longfellow has their own and Twain has their own,
Right.
Mhm.
and then you're moving all those second graders, I mean, the implications of, would there be sort of like a balanced swap out?
I actually think, because Twain typically has more room in the after-school
Okay.
program than Longfellow, so it actually could help build some capacity.
Okay.
And similarly, although this year Man had a waiting list, Man and Shimmick similarly, Shimmick tends to be more full than Man. So,
Are there more kids that tend to participate in the lower grades than the upper grades?
yeah,
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 so I could see that being an issue too.
right, yeah, because once they get fifth,
Yeah,
sixth.
because once they fifth, sixth, I know they don't want to be there.
Mhm.
They prefer to walk the
Right.
2-3
Right.
miles.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And I know that some before and after school programs have kind of entertained the notion of doing something a little different with the older kids so that they wouldn't feel like they, you know.
Like clubs or something?
Right, something that's more interesting,
Yeah.
a little cooler.
Mhm.
I think it'd be really important to determine if we're gonna make that commitment to having all students return to whatever their home school would have been typically. Whether we have the fleet, you know, whether we have the buses to do it, whether we want to make the commitment with the general fund dollars to do that kind of thing, because it really makes a difference. You know, if we're not going to do that, then families are gonna feel like those spots are just open and a free-for-all again, and
Yeah.
who's gonna get them, and we'll have that kind of thing going on too. And with that, I think we're done and entertain no more questions.
I do have a question, maybe it goes back to building blocks for you, Steve, but with the closing of Hoover, current Hoover, I just want to maybe take a look at the kids that live closest to actual Hoover. The distance from there to Mark Twain is right on that 2 mile plus border, and maybe that's something we'll have to look at, because I would prefer not to have to add another bus there when they could go to Lemmy or Lucas, which are just a mile or less for both of those schools. So that might be another building block we might have to take a look at.
All right, what I might do is see if we can run one of those road maps. I'm looking over your head. Run one of those road maps that shows from Old Hoover the mile, 2 mile road distances. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, the easiest elementary school to fill is Old Hoover. In our data that we got, 0 to half a mile, it was number 1 of all the elementaries.
Right, but if it's going to close, all I'm suggesting is that there's 2 other elementaries that are less than a mile away.
So I really appreciate all of this work and really looking at the pros and cons, and I feel like I got a good handle of where the board members sit on kind of their thought process on this, and so I'm kind of going to put everybody on the spot and really ask you if you had a tipping point leaning towards pairing or not leaning towards pairing, because there were pros and cons on all of them. From your perspective, from what you do in your job, I'd kind of like to know what everybody thinks about doing it, whether it tips one way or the other. Because it's not the perspective we're coming at it from, and so I expect it to be different, but I'd really like to know.
And can I tag onto that? Because I was wondering, as you were putting together the pros and cons, have you gathered any information from teachers and third year principals and building staff, or is this really your point of view and your analysis, and that we still need to go out and talk to, folks in the buildings to get into that? So it's I think it's related.
Well, the building part of it is our input, August 28th.
Okay,
On the
so you have
timeline.
it. Okay.
Well, I mean that for us. That's
Yeah.
when they bring that, but I don't know what you guys have done.
Right, I talked to a few program coordinators to get their, like the library coordinator to get some information from them, but other than that, I haven't talked to other people as well. Just based on the information that I was asked to bring, it seems like the positives certainly outweigh any of the negatives, and I think the negatives we can overcome, from my perspective.
I guess I might need to know a little bit more about what kind of problem you're trying to solve. If it's achievement related, really research indicates that teachers working together and the shared belief that they can make a difference is really the number one thing that will make a difference. And then beyond that, instructional practice, and I know those are things we're working on all the time, but those are really the most important things. Structures and ways to organize either schedules or grade configurations, or you'll hear a lot about block scheduling, that kind of thing, really don't make as big of a difference as instruction and the power of teachers believing that they make a difference. So, but I know that this is a complex issue, and this is a culmination of years of discussion, so I'm sure it's not that, this isn't boiled down to only those couple of things that I mentioned, but I just want to make sure that what you're trying to solve will really be addressed by reconfiguring.
Yeah, I would just echo what both Diane and Lisa said. I think in addition to that, I would want to establish the priority that as we continue to plan, we think about the most vulnerable student and families and then design it from there, because whatever support services structures we put in place for the most vulnerable students and families in our district, then that's going to work for everybody else. And so, I think if you look at it from that lens, then, everything else could potentially fall into place. And I remember when I was the principal at Wickham, and back in the day, there was a consideration of Wickham and Kirkwood, I think it was, pairing, and Anita and I were all for it. We were ready to dive in and go after it. So I think the people at the building level, if they also understand that, problem that you're trying to solve, as Lisa says, and the reasons and the benefits and what we're trying to attain, I think people will really be on board with it as long as we help them understand how the structures might change, but that the bigger purpose is the experiences that it'll provide to our students. Joan?
Yeah, okay. Well, I have a unique perspective because for the homeless kids, this is kind of a no-brainer because we're, particularly between Longfellow and Twain, we have very high concentration of homeless kids at Twain right now, which has been hugely challenging. But I also have a perspective of being both a Twain and Longfellow parent. And we absolutely love Twain. We love the diversity. But my kids who were higher achieving didn't have strong peers. But now that, then we went to Longfellow, loved Longfellow. They had the academic challenges, but they didn't have the diversity. And so to me, it's the perfect world to blend it because I kind of wanted both. And it's, so anyway, am I speaking out of turn by talking to the parent? I'm sorry. But I personally, as a parent, which I'm not supposed to be talking about right now, I don't.
I think it speaks to Lisa's question of what problem we're trying to solve. I think we're trying to solve academic achievement, and making sure all students have the same opportunities for excelling, and better balance in elementaries, we believe, is one means of helping our students be more successful and making sure they've got the right support systems, they've got the right headroom if that's what they need. So it really does need to be around student success, I think, is what we're trying to solve right now with that real disparate success levels of different schools. Am I?
And I think, aside from achievement, I think there's just a basic fairness question too. I just think when it comes down to it, just, are we offering, really an equitable, is it fair? And, right now we're in this situation that isn't. So, even though academic is super important and we're always going to keep our eye on that ball, I think just some of these fundamental kind of fairness questions come up. So.
Would you like to weigh in here? I know you've been a part of more of the conversation, so kind of heard what we're talking about too.
While we've been talking about student achievement and balancing the demographics, I think that things is kind of exciting to see the fact that you gave us, for example, the Shimmick man pairing is, we know our smaller buildings tend to run pretty inefficiently, and when I see us allocate 1 FTE to a grade level and across the district we're as high as 5 FTE for that same grade level, it's just nice to even think about that teacher collaboration, professional development opportunities for our teaching staff. I also think about in the slide that Steve shares, if we have them then all at that RAM 3 level of 26 and 30, we're not going to have the same teaching FTE, and so our win or our cost that we get back there, is that going to be, equally or offset by transportation? So does this become a wash, or are there enough facility changes that are going to become necessary that, there is going to be a cost to this, but what are we willing to do, I think is the question. I think you heard from our team that on the education side that there's nothing insurmountable with trying to pair our schools, and there's some exciting possibilities about the potential of doing that.
Thank you. That was
Yeah.
great. And short.
But
It does. It gives it a big.
So, can I just say something? So, when JP and I had our 2-on-1 meeting with Steve, it was after our last board meeting, and something that I brought up, and I guess just maybe just throw it out there before we go down this road too much further. is that obviously I'm very interested in the Longfellow Twain. I think the Shin McMahon is a good idea too, but I really would like to focus on the two ends of the spectrum. So trying to get this group and this group more to this, and that Shin McMahon, like I said, is a good idea, but it's two schools that are kind of in the middle. And I would like to maybe try and see if we could focus and take a look more at like the Borlaug, Alexander, before we go too far down this road with just these two right away, to kind of see what that looks like. And
Well,
just throwing it out there.
The only thing I would say on the Shin McMahon is the operational efficiencies that give you the opportunity to do some things with pairings that may not be that are gonna cost us some money. And especially with the Shin McMahon, we have the opportunity because the renovations at Shimmick haven't, they're on the drawing board, but we still have time that if there's a chance to modify it so the pairing is more optimal before we spend the money and bust out concrete and redo what we just did, I think that has to stay on there just because of the operational efficiencies and the savings that we could get that would help us to balance other areas that are going to be more needing, but also may require some funds and some savings that we can get elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I see your point there. I guess I also know that Kirkwood and Wood and I think there's one other school there that they also have renovations coming up. Borlaug. So those are three schools on the spectrum too, that we're the two ends of the spectrum that we're looking at.
And geographically too, you got some in the north, and I know it's gonna be a pain, but I'd like to sooner rather than later tackle the secondary feeder thing, because it's gonna come up with Kirkwood, Borlaug, or Kirkwood, if that ended up being the thing. So I think the sooner we can start working through some of those things. I'm really excited about hearing from you guys about what I heard were a few obstacles that are not at all insurmountable, and then quite a few potential real benefits. The kinds of things, it's hard for people to imagine what it's like to be the only fifth grade teacher in a building, and how lonely, teaching is isolating anyway. You're in your classroom, and it's hard enough to collaborate with your team, but if you don't even have a team to collaborate with, and now with our PD, Amy mentioned, to get two buildings together for PD, right now is pretty much not, we're not getting much out of it. If you have 25 minutes and you have to travel, that's not very valuable. And so to create some real valuable PD opportunities for our team, I can get really excited about that. And so since I'm not seeing any real big red flags there, I think the more we can find, just say, okay, this looks good at this point, and then how can we expand that circle to achieve our goals, which is to get, some demographic balance.
So I think we need to get through the next work session, which is the operations updates, and see, to get the complete picture.
The finance.
It's transportation, nutrition, playgrounds, that stuff, facilities.
I was just going to say that because I am sort of stuck between the points that Paul and Phil were making in that, it may cost. Amy said maybe it's a wash, maybe it does have a cost, and if we need to save money in one place to make another one work, that's great. But we have been put in this situation and we felt this imperative that we got to do stuff for the kids who really have high needs now, and the current plan is not doing that for all those kids, right? So I see Paul's point too, right? How do we address those kids? So really knowing some of the operational side of it, to know some cost stuff, I think would help me at least, balance, going towards your point versus, folks that doesn't really understand what we can or can't do. Because I know what I want to do, but I don't know what we can't do.
But this is super encouraging though. That there's positives, things that you're saying would actually be beneficial, things to watch for, plan for, that would be negatives that we just did with proper planning and implementation we could overcome. So this feels very encouraging for the next work session where maybe some of the cost stuff might be, we'll see.
I guess just if we're looking at some other, if we are going to look at Kirkwood, Wickham, or Kirkwood, Borlaug, I think we'd want to know those numbers for that operations meeting too. Like what are the capacity, current, future,
Yep.
transportation, that type of stuff, that.
Well, and remember,
Facilities.
part of the idea was to go through this so that you had a better grounding in it, and then, as we approach the start of the school year, that opportunity to bring in principals, to bring in BASP directors, to bring in teachers, hear from them, really get an understanding of their thoughts about how might this work on the ground. They may be thinking about different implications than we're thinking about, and make sure that we get their voice, but to ground it then in your knowledge base of the bigger picture things that we're bringing forward. And school's right around the corner, so it's not that far off.
Yeah, I just don't want it to feel like, I have press here, but I don't want it to feel like we're only looking at these 4 schools.
Right.
We're sort of using it as a test case, though, to kind of go through and understand pros, cons, across all these different dimensions. And then once we've got that bigger grounding, then I feel like we've got, at least for me, I'll have kind of a baseline of understanding of what we're dealing with, and then
No,
that gives us the opportunity to explore.
I get it, I just don't want it to be out there that we're only
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about these
So
4 schools.
let the minutes reflect that
And,
we're doing, the
and a reminder
baseline
on
understanding
one of the
before we
earlier
consider.
charts that we did then take a look at based on your comments as a board, what were the other geographic pairings that address that top line, bottom line gap that you talked about, I think 2 work sessions ago? So we talked about, again, from a geographic position, as you look at New Hoover and Alexander and their approximate distances, talked about Lucas and Wood. And then across on the other side of the river, obviously, we talked about the Kirkwood Borlaug, but we also talked about Wickham Coralville Central. So just as a reminder, yes, there were, we looked at the geographic proximity, we looked at top line, bottom line, try to, what happens if you moved more groups to lines 2 and 3.
And I think we need to keep the operational efficiency, I think those points a good one, we need to keep that in mind, because again, efficiencies can help fund some of these other deficits.
And if you remember, I know there's so much paper out there, but I think it's 2 board sessions ago that when I ran those numbers and we looked at where they might fit on a tier 1, 2, 3, that we were looking at saving anywhere from 6 to 8 FTEs with those
Right,
pairings.
yeah.
And you couldn't add them all up because we had a couple schools that we paired a couple different ways. But if you think about it from that standpoint, that efficiency is generating, that's a fairly hefty return where those resources could be reallocated then inside the system.
Yeah.
So I think that's important to keep in mind too, because that is an annual recurring cost, right? So, something to think about.
Well, I guess, and I'm not the one doing the work, but it seems that it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to add one more, like add Kirkwood Borlaug into the discussion. I mean, I'm kind of going through all the slides, and all those considerations that we all just talked about
Absolutely.
are still the considerations, and I was trying to figure out, there's nothing very specific as to the pairing. I mean, each one's going to be its own little challenge, and it's going to have very specific things associated with it, but I think even, I don't know, Paul's kind of alluding to it, if you have the numbers out there for that as another pairing,
Well, again,
it
remember,
stands out as we were talking about it, other than let the minutes reflect that we're talking about it, right? You know what I mean? Like, it's out there, and all of these things are still important, and if it becomes something that there is something specific to that pairing, whether it's the operational side, or even going back and kind of looking at this, like if something stood out to any one of you of looking at those 2 schools, like, oh, well, we didn't even think about that, that'd be good to know, but I think the information we got is still applicable.
exactly. The idea is what can you apply to any pairing in the district, recognizing that there'll be some idiosyncrasies with any given pairing. And that's whether it's Title I, whether it's BASP programs, we know that there'll be some
Personnel.
Yes, exactly, but there are some things that are going to be generic to all of them, how you assign locations for BASP programs, things like that. You're going to want to look at holistically that would apply to any pairing we do.
So did we decide that we're gonna have Borlaug, so Borlaug Kirkwood?
Those, we ran those numbers. I think we ran those numbers. I'll have to go back and look.
Yep.
Yeah, you should have had those, I think, in the last one. So the numbers are out there. I don't think necessarily when we look at it and say, let's come back and look at any of these slides up here, you're not going to see major differences in any of those because these are more holistic. We can look at some idiosyncrasies that go along with each of those, but you might want to wait until we get a little bit further into the dialogue and have the feedback from staff.
Yeah.
So where it might be more pertinent is who we invite in to talk to you
Yeah, yeah.
when we
I
get to the
think that's
building
right.
level. Which principals, which teachers, which BASP directors,
Yeah,
perhaps parents
yeah.
from those catchment areas, PTO or something like that.
Mhm.
So I think that's where it will really be pertinent. I think prior to that, whether it's operational or.
I think that to a certain degree, there's the facilities discussion, like early on, it's gonna be, well, this one's gonna need some work, we're gonna have kindergartners in it. You know, so I think kind of knowing that,
Yep.
that part of it is a little more specific, so
Yeah.
it'd be good to at least pass
You'll get some
along for the
generalities
next-
from Craig and Adam and Ben and Dwayne and the rest of them next week. And then, again, if there's a specific one or two that you want to hone in on, then we can look at the idiosyncrasies that have to come out of the education program or that may come out of the facilities.
I guess maybe it's just because we don't know Dwayne and those guys are gonna come back and actually present to us. So if they're actually talking like, we're looking at Twain and this is how many rooms they have and this is how many rooms Longfellow has, like, then I guess that's where I think Sean and I are going, where we would want to hear the Kirkwood side of whoever we pair with.
I can definitely ask them to be more specific on some of those. So if you want to look at Kirkwood Borlaug and you want to look at Lemmy or Twain Longfellow, I can definitely focus on those two.
Anything else on this one? Again, thank you all so much for preparing and coming and submitting to us. Going through that, it's very, very helpful. The next topic is the meetings that we have coming up, and I think we can just take a look at those and see where we are in terms of who's attending where, just confirm. Can you pull it up, Steve? Thank you.
And I filled it out tonight, and I didn't see that it was on here, but I put myself on for the Boston Lake Community on the 8 with JP.
Okay.
And I have been speaking with Henry Harper to have one at the satellite police station over there at Pepperwood,
Yeah.
Pepperwood Place, something there, so, but I don't have a date as of yet, but it would, it's gonna, it's,
Can you add that, Kim,
I
on
will.
the bottom row?
Yep.
yeah.
And then once you have the date, you can put
Right,
that in and
yeah.
figure out, I'm assuming we would go with another phone number.
Yeah, I will be at Dow, I'll relay that on to Kim as soon as we get that finalized.
Perfect.
So one other one, Jen, sorry, that's not on here, and I mean, you can just add on for notes, and I didn't do a formal presentation, but I did meet with Mark Nolte and Kate Moreland, and I can, it was part of our discussion.
Okay. So we should add it to note that that took place. Yeah, that's cool.
When was that, Paul?
What's that?
When was that? Do you remember? It's all right if you don't.
Whatever
You
day
can let me
that I
know.
gave you for director liaison reports.
Okay.
So let's look at the upcoming ones real fast. There's a couple that don't have anyone signed up. So on the 16th, I was going to take the, obviously, corporate convention visitors bureau board. I've got that on my calendar. If anyone else wants to come on, you're welcome. Sean, you're handling the North Liberty Optimist. That's still good for you on
Yep.
the 23rd. Lori and I are going to do the obviously Area Chamber of Commerce on the 23rd as well. No one has signed up yet.
I'm gonna do affordable housing.
Are you? Thank you, Ruthina. Thank you. I was not able to do that one. Is there anyone else that's,
Can't do that one.
it's hard, new ones are hard.
It's in
to
the,
get.
yeah, it's in the middle of the day, I can do it, it's fine.
Okay. So we'll add Ruthina to affordable housing. Thank you, Pam.
We don't know where
I
that's.
might be able to do the 16th.
I don't know where it's at.
The one at 4.
Yeah.
Yeah. Join me.
Okay.
I'll be there.
Okay.
And you're able to join. That's great.
I mean, I can probably.
What day of the week is 9?
We used to Saturday at most times.
9/1.
It's a Saturday.
It is a Saturday.
That's a Saturday?
Mhm.
I could do the Center for Worker Justice.
I could do that one too, I think.
Okay.
If, and that's the one that says,
1:30.
oh, yeah, there it is. Okay, I can do that.
Okay, so Phil and GP, yay, we've got those covered, and the affordable housing. Remind me who's doing, oh, Ruthina, thank you.
I might be able to make that one work too.
Yeah.
Throw my name on there and.
Okay, good, Sean. Okay, awesome, thank you. Then Rotary's covered on the 6th, Boston Way, JP taking that one.
And Phil said he's gonna be
MCJC, Rufina.
And Rufina, I might be able to come along on that one.
Okay.
Yeah, on the 19th.
And we don't have a time yet or date for Forest View, CWG Forest View. And, so were you doing that one? Were you contacting CWG?
I wasn't contacting them. I don't know who did, with the forest viewers, and maybe Lori.
I mean, it was
I think Lori's working on that.
Okay, she is. Then I have not done anything with the, obviously, the Area Association of Realtors, I've been on that. And we've got a time and date, we're waiting confirmation on the Sudanese Community Organization. I would be able to do that one, but we'll just have to confirm that. Sunrise Optimist, who's taking
I'm working on that.
Okay.
I still haven't got a date worked out.
Okay.
Or did you have?
No, I'm just saying on the 29th I can make that too. I mean, if it happens at that time, then
Yeah, I
I
could
can.
do that too. ICEA, I haven't talked to Mr. Brady.
I talked to Brady, well, not mentioning.
No,
Principal.
That's gonna be hard for me to not say this.
I know, I did meet with Brady, just, I mean, kind of like Paul said, he met some coaches informally, but we talked about it. So, I'd be happy to meet with the bigger organization or their exec board.
Yeah.
We didn't.
You can get through from that.
Yeah, well, yeah, we just had a pretty rough conversation.
So, I feel like before we start bringing teachers in to have conversations, but I feel like we need to have ICEA on board with what we're doing and that we're bringing teachers in to have these conversations, do you think? So I'm not sure when the timing would be for some of those teacher chats, but somewhere in September, I think we should probably do something with ICEA, maybe the exec board.
But Janet, on our timeline, teachers are coming in on August 28th.
But I can't imagine.
Remember, we made that timeline as aggressive as we could, just because that was in the how quickly can you do it mode.
Yeah.
So that's what we put down for you, recognizing that we might not go that fast, but we wanted to make sure that that was how quickly we could do it.
So I can shoot an email to Brady and see, like, I think meeting with their exec board would be a good idea, and I'll see when.
Maybe sooner rather than later, maybe we can sit down and,
Before school starts, I'm thinking it's gonna be a challenge.
yeah,
But I'll ask.
yeah.
I just know there's already teachers talking about it, so.
I know that for a fact too, yeah, I do.
Me too.
I think people are talking, and there's some, questions and wondering what's gonna happen, and what we're doing, and I think it's fair enough. So, probably sooner. And DPO, is that? I'm not even sure what DPO would want to try to target for this conversation.
I don't know where they were at with setting their speakers for all their meetings. I mean, there was like a couple of DPO folks that are still.
And we pointed out at the time that they could set that up, and Eric seemed to agree that that would be not too hard to do that. And I think we emphasized the urgency at that time, so.
I could follow up
out?
with the
You wanna
email
follow
to
up,
the
then?
DPO presidents, since Eric and.
Is Brad still co-president? He's past president.
I think it's done. I think
Is it
new-
Terry?
I don't know who the new folks are.
Marion.
Is it Miriam? And Eric.
So that would be helpful, to see when we could get our things scheduled with them.
Usually they have their, like, meeting list put out on the website. I wonder if they.
But we're always there to present, and we could just present this.
Yeah.
First DPO meeting of the year.
Press our slides like these guys did. 'Cause we
I know.
about 5 minutes.
You should send
Talk
me
for an
like
hour and a half.
really fast.
Corporal optimist though. I've talked really fast.
Yeah, we talk really fast. So I think we've filled in at least the most near-term items, and we've got some action items following up on these. So, is there anything else on this one you want to cover? We good? Anything else for the good of the cause? This was our last agenda item of the night.
You scared everyone else off. Did you guys have any questions you wanted to ask us? We can go through this process.
You know, I was just interested in hearing where you were meeting, because I know some,
Yeah, we were just looking at the list.
yeah, because these are some of the folks that we want to make sure are included, and so I was nosy.
Are there some groups that you think are missing that we should
No,
cover?
I think it's good.
Okay.
And I appreciate the efforts to reach out to some of the more non-traditional groups, so.
All right, I'm gonna call it 7:17. Thank you.